Thank you so much for that introduction. Welcome, everybody. We're delighted that you're here with us this afternoon. So I'm just going to jump into our questions. We thank all the panelists for being here. I feel it's just great to be surrounded by a wonderful fellow scientists. Yes, as Will mentioned, so my background is actually in marine bioacoustics. Long story short, I'm more into sustainable systems now, so I look at things quite differently than I used to, but I'm informed by that background. So that's my connection to water. In addition to that, my efforts right now with the city are directly related to the Helene recovery efforts. So I work with multiple federal, regional, and local partners to clean our waterways, right-of-ways, and private property. And so just so y'all know, that's my connection to this group. All right, with that being said, let's jump into questions. So some of these questions, from what I understand, were provided by students, as well as other members as well of our community. All right, so we're going to start off with a general question for each of our panelists. If you could each tell us more about your work and research that wasn't already covered in your biographies. If there's anything specific that you would like to share with this particular audience, relevant to Helene recovery, climate change, anything like that, we welcome those remarks. Thank you.
Never want to talk about myself, so we'll jump into what Hayward Waterways is doing related to Helene. It very much is a reset for us from Fred and expanding that to the county. So we are already in this mode after Fred. One in particular result from that is the flood risk reduction plan that was developed just as Helene was entering the area, and officially published in November, funded by the Land and Water Fund. It's the first ever H&H modeling 1 and 2D effort from Clyde to Crusoe, which has already brought in over $41 million in, or roughly $44 million in grants, whether it be restoration, infrastructure, or recovery to the town of Canton in that area. So our focus continues to be recovery, the litter cleanup programs, but also shifting and supporting our partners in that flood resiliency space. So the town of Canton, Clyde, and the county and others are always looking to us and the Army Corps and our other partners to develop these models for them to go after more shovel-ready projects. So restoration continues to be a focus for us right now. Yep.
All right, so yeah, my name's Dylan Owensby. I'm a biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. That's the state agency that does things like permit fishing licenses, hunting licenses, enforcement of those rules, and then try to promote game fish populations and terrestrial wildlife populations. But my job specifically, aquatic wildlife diversity biologist, it's a mouthful, but basically it's just conservation of aquatic species. And specifically I work with mussels, fish, and crayfish in western North Carolina. So since Hurricane Helene, we've been very concerned about the species that we work on and how they're doing. We were able to get out a couple months before it got cold and everything kind of slows down a little bit to check, just do some initial checks across the basins that were most heavily damaged. And we got mixed results, some positive news, I'd say, and so some areas that got hit a little harder. So I can go into a little more detail on what we saw, but the overall story is things fared better than we expected in certain areas and took a toll in other areas. So. Oh, there you're more mobile.
Yeah. Hey, so Ronnie Leeper, I'm going to add a little bit to what I do. I've gotten a lot more into drought monitoring than land surface interaction, but as you were indicating, I'm kind of informed by that. I would say that one of the things that is kind of new to my research is linking measurements of soil moisture observations, which typically haven't been available, into understanding how much water in the ground is available to plants. So I'm a little bit different than stream flow or things like that nature, but how much water you have below your feet, it really controls how much water falls from the sky and ends up into the stream. Does it run along the surface or does it go through the soil? How vegetation is healthy depends on how much soil moisture you have available to it for it to do photosynthesis and things of that nature. And then that can contribute to how much of the solar energy is going to be contributed to heating the atmosphere instead of evaporating water from the plant's leaves. So this is kind of the area that I'm kind of getting into and understanding the role of soil moisture and how it impacts us with drought or floods or hydrological dynamics. Connecting it to Helene, which was kind of the last part of the question there. I don't know if many of you all know this, but we were going into a drought prior to really heavy rains that came through and kind of flooded everything. It kind of changed the dynamics. And then we almost went through 30 days without rain right after Helene, which when I was rebuilding my house from the flood, it was kind of nice. I didn't have to worry about rain coming in and adding more water to the situation. But we kind of went through a climate whiplash where we were drought, we had a flood, and then we kind of went back to another drying pattern. And one of the things we want to know is how is that whiplash, how does that impact our ecosystems and life?
That's a fascinating point. That's only happened 5 times in the history going back. Out of NCDC, they're providing that data. Fred was our most recent one. So these extremes we're seeing more often. To your groundwater point, if you don't know, I love saying this fact, Haywood County has no surface water entering the county. It all exits. So all the water that you do see flowing across our watershed is via rainfall, but also groundwater. I thought that was really important.
Sorry, do you mind if
Oh my gosh, yeah. Steal your mic.
No,
Yeah.
it's okay. Let me see if I can disconnect it. All right. Thank you, everybody. All right, so let's dive into some of the specifics in terms of the Helene impacts, if we could. So just depending on expertise and comfort level. If you could talk a little bit about what you do know, even if it's just preliminary data, about specific animal and plant populations, like how were they affected, if the data are available, because as we all know that those data aren't always available, but if you could speak to that, that would be helpful.
So Haywood Waterways, we've been monitoring the Pigeon River watershed for 27 years across 26 sites. We do water quality through VWIM, but also macroinvertebrates through SMIE program. As part of that data collection, we were offline for several months, longer in the water quality perspective, but more so just across the board. We have seen the macros come back, in particular, not related to Helene, but post-mill closure. We saw the water quality in the macros, the benthic zone really flourish below the mill. Things are not perfect, but we are seeing a drastic improvement, and that was 4 weeks after closure. Just kind of give you a quick timeline. As it relates to Helene, not necessarily the aquatic and or the plant matter, but the physical landscape, Fred did more of a carving, right, of our channels. It dug deeper. It left behind a lot of sand deposition, which really interrupted the macro, population, if you will, in particular up in the East Fork. Helene did more of a carving out, rather a widening, as opposed to carving in. So we're seeing the landscape kind of broaden and our channels broaden in that way too, and the height of our channels, the depths, are also shrinking in that regard. So the landscapes, the places that these fish and these animals are living in are changing, and that's kind of what we're focusing on too through Haywood Waterways.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of that. The Pigeon River, we started doing monitoring right before the mill closed, and I've been doing it either once or twice a year since. And we've seen just an explosion both in total number of fish species and the total number of fish. So that's been a really positive note, not related to Hurricane Helene, but I like to spread that message whenever we can. So to start off with that positive. And then as far as Helene goes, as I kind of touched on earlier, it's been a mixed bag. Overall, I mean, it's hard to believe, but a lot of the fish, they're able to find refuge spots pretty well, as long as there are still refuge spots around. So if it comes up slow enough, they can move out into the floodplain, find refuge spots. Otherwise, there's structure in the stream, big boulders, root wads, old trees, that kind of thing they can hide behind and get out of the high flows. What they can't escape from is if it's a situation where it's like total scour, where you have so much force coming through with either a high gradient or a narrow channel or a combo of both of those, like in a gorge type situation. Those are the situations where it's more likely that we're going to see drastic population declines, where things either get crushed by moving substrate, large boulders and things, or just get moved out of the system. We don't have a lot of answers yet. A lot of our surveys have just been kind of preliminary spot checking a few sites. But overall, like I said, it's been more positive than we were afraid it might be. As far as my region, the region I work in, the areas that got hit the hardest were probably the Swannanoa system in Asheville, which actually didn't have as many really sensitive species already since it's such an urban system. But the Nolichucky system, just east of there, where Burnsville and Spruce Pine, those areas are, that area got hit pretty hard. We have one of those taxonomic groups we work with the most are freshwater mussels. They're one of the most endangered groups of animals in the whole world, really. And we do a lot of work with trying to conserve them. We have, from just early preliminary surveys, good results, especially like in the pigeon system, in the upper French Broad. But the Nolichucky, it seems like some of those populations, although they are still around, it seems like they have really drastic declines. So that's just kind of as much of an overview summary as I can give at this point without, it'll probably take another year or two of doing surveys before we have more information.
Yeah, so I'm going to take it a little bit of a different direction here. So since we were a little bit drier before Helene came in, the soils that we had were parched and they were able to take on some of the rainfall. And that's actually ended up being a good thing, even though a lot of places flooded and a lot of places got impacted. I guess what I'm saying is if the soils were wet prior to the pre-rain event and Helene, it could have been worse. So the soils kind of helped us out a little bit, absorbed some of that water. But when you put that much water into the soil, it changes the structural dynamics. So this can lead to landslides and things like that we saw. And it can also make it easier for trees to blow over. And so we had a lot of trees get knocked down with the strong winds, with the lean, which was very strong actually to make it this far north and still be have tropical style winds. So we knocked all the trees over, and while the landscape is recovering, we still have a lot of fuels on the ground now that the trees have died and they're turning into a hazard in terms of fire risk and future fire potential. So there's a lot of fuels out there on the ground that I think there's actually a bird ban in place now, and I think there's some concern about that going forward. So even though Helene's long gone, some of the impacts that it had on the landscape it's with us.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just one brag about the pigeon. We have one of the best tangerine darter populations in the area. Luke always likes to brag on this. I'll mention that. But if you ask any of the anglers out there, any of the guides, they're still biting, right? So we still see the activity from the economy side too, because if that wasn't there, they wouldn't be fishing, right? So we are just kind of seeing that anecdotally on the side as well.
Thank you. So I think it would be helpful for members of the audience too to hear a little bit more about the methods that you all employ to study the environment. So for us to kind of talk about these findings, these observations, there's a lot of data collection. So that also takes resources, financial resources, trained people, right, with the appropriate expertise. But also, there's a lot of specific tools that are used in order to monitor our waterways and then the different organisms that reside in these waterways. So could y'all just take a few moments and talk about some of the tools, if you will, that you use, or if you partner with another organization to do the field work, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Because we do so much and we touch everything water, we'll do water quality sampling from fecal related to our phase 2 stormwater work as we contracted for the towns to regulate and make sure that things that are moving through the urban environment don't end up in our waterways, to the SMIE and or the VWIN, the monitoring networks that we've been running for a couple of decades. All of this gets sent over to DEQ and others, and they'll in turn reach back out to us to do spot checks. Say post-Helene, we were looking at Richland in particular for some sewage leaks, and or really we're just kind of there ready for the partner to tap us, the EPA. We guided them downriver for several weeks, spotting hazardous spills and or materials to pull out. And another part of what we do, and yes, data collection is always there, we're looking at kind of data-driven projects. We're trying to find these hotspots throughout the county to get ahead of these issues, but really what we have found to be the best data collection method is the community. We are not the water police, but we are only a team of 4 and a membership of a couple hundred. But when the community tells us what's going on, we can get put into action to go out to assess that problem and find the solution. Another part of what we do, and necessarily data collection, is education. If we could turn that back into an investment to someone to become a citizen scientist to support our monitoring programs, that's what we're more focused on right now.
Yeah, so we're doing mostly population monitoring, and we'll use a number of different tools for that. If it's mussels we're looking at, and even sometimes fish, depending on the species, one of our best tools is actually just snorkeling. So that's just putting a snorkel mask on. A lot of times we have to wear waders or wetsuit, or wetsuit or dry suit because it's pretty cold. But that's a tool that just about anybody can get and go and observe the species that we're looking at. But with most of the fish, we use electrofishing as our primary tool. That's just putting electricity into the water to temporarily stun the fish, and then we use a variety of nets, just a lot of different things like that. Crayfish sampling is just nets and trying to disturb the habitat so we can flush them out and get our hands on them. But another really important tool we use as far as conservation goes, we work on population reintroductions and augmentation, and we have hatcheries both internally in the commission, and then we have partners that we work with. They raise some of these rare species that we're trying to either reintroduce that have been wiped out of certain waterways, or we're trying to bolster their populations if they're dwindling. So that's an important one. And then another important tool is working with partners like Haywood Waterways and a lot of other partners, because the most effective thing is trying to spread word through outreach and that kind of thing to get people to buy in to conservation of our aquatic species and how they can help with land management and all that kind of stuff. So those are kind of the main tools that I wanted to highlight anyway.
So when I'm looking at drought or flooding potential, I'm really looking at how much water is in the ground. And in the past, we've never really monitored soil moisture until really the past 10 years. You're starting to see mesonettes starting to deploy these sensors in the ground. They're very difficult to install. You have to dig a pit. You typically get multiple layers in the ground, so it's very labor intensive. And then when the sensors crap out on you or they don't work, you have to go back in and put a new one in. So it's not like sticking a thermometer on a tower. It's a lot of work. And so we've traditionally not been monitoring that. But the science has gone a long way in starting to take those measurements and collect them in the field. And so a lot of what I'm doing is using a lot of statistics to kind of understand what the measurements are telling us and how can we use it. How can we use the information from the sensors to look at drought, to look at flood? Those are two different types of approaches. With drought, you always have to compare it to something, right? Because it's a relative term. Are you drier than usual or wetter than usual? So usually you need 30 or 40 or 50 years of data to understand what's typical for this time of year. And then you can say, well, okay, am I below or above that? But with soil moisture, if you only have 10 years of data, that's very difficult to do. So we've really gone into looking at the type of soils that the sensors are placed within. And so there's a lot of providing context to the measurement that way. And when you frame it in terms of how much water in the soil is available to plants, then you can start, you don't need 30 years to know that, hey, when I have this much, this is when the plant's going to wilt. And those are important things that we're trying to tease out with the data sets that we now have. And then we're also thinking about ways to integrate not just what we're measuring on the ground, but what the satellites are seeing. So we get not just 1 or 2 locations maybe in a county, but we can get the spatial footprint of what the soil moisture conditions are across landscapes where it's really difficult to monitor. Because those sensors are just looking at the brightness of the ground through radiance, you need to relate those measurements to the station data. So the station data is going to correct that, and then you kind of find a way to bring them in. So to answer your question, we do a lot of statistical analysis. It's not a lot of fun, but whenever you find something that works, you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So basically using it, and then I think also getting out and talking to people and figuring out, hey, if I give you this quantity, can you make a decision off of it? And that's that's going out and meeting farmers, that's going out and talking to people in the field and figuring out what they need so we can fine tune our measurements that way to serve a purpose.
Thank you. I think there's a couple of key points that all of the panelists did mention that I want to make sure that I emphasize. So one thing about the kind of work that I've done in the past and they're doing now is long-term monitoring projects, right? So this is not something like you can't tease out certain patterns without having years of data, right? And so being able to fund, 10, 20-year studies is really critical to help us to understand the environment and also how human impacts, anthropogenic impacts. Also the importance of partnerships. I cannot emphasize this enough throughout my career and also based on what these panelists just shared. Partnerships is absolutely key to carrying out the work that we're all doing. Without partnerships, we couldn't go anywhere, right? And so even in my current role, just if I could just say a couple quick words, I mentioned in the introduction some of the work I'm doing with recovery efforts, but a lot of that is not just sitting in the same room with people, it's also finding common ground, it's also communication styles. Everybody kind of has like their own focus with respect to what are called missions when it comes to recovery, so figuring out what language to use to reach the people in that space to move the needle is super important, so I just wanted to mention that as well. All right. So we talked about a couple of things. I want to just make sure we just do a quick recap. So specific methods that these panelists employ in their work, thinking about what they're seeing in terms of post-Helene impacts, some surprises, which is always exciting to hear with respect to resilient or resiliency, depending on where you're from, who you're speaking with. But something else I wanted to talk a little bit more about is, there's a lot of talk about, okay, so the waterways were impacted in a variety of ways after Helene, so we have physical debris in the waterways, and so now there's this, what was going to be a 1.5-year effort is now supposed to be accomplished in 6 months, so we are removing all this debris roughly 5 feet below the water's surface in certain designated areas, and so I wanted to ask the panelists about what are some of, from their area of expertise, or keeping that in mind, what are some of the key considerations? So if you were, I'm going to take a bit of a leap for some of you, but if you were in charge of these waterway operations, given your field of expertise, what are some important considerations? Like how would you inform those operators on the ground to do that work to protect the environment? Would anybody like to take that question? Yeah.
Do we think that any recovery efforts are going to be a leave no trace situation? I think that would flip the question back. We have to get into the water to get the items out, the debris out. It's a lesser of two evils. We were doing this for 3 years after Fred, 6 months, and or however timeline you all have over in the fringe. We're looking at a decade plus. This is more than just woody debris. This is more than just infrastructure risk downstream. We look at the holistic and that we have the litter cleanups across private properties, things that are entrenched even from '04, we're still trying to unpack. So this is a long-term effort on our end. We work hand in hand with those folks that are moving the heavy equipment into the water, and the best that we can do is abide by the regulations provided from the agencies, but also to be there in person. So it's a tough job to go sit down by the creek and watch someone else do the work for you, but that's something that sometimes we'll have to do. We'll do some monitoring above and below. That'll be another tool that we can ensure that the water quality remains as it should. And then we kick into action post cleanup, and that will restore and or bring back to life that bank or that floodplain as best as we can pre-event.
Yeah, this is something that has become a huge concern for us because I like to think of it, you have the impact from the hurricane itself, the immediate impact, which is kind of what I was hitting on earlier, but then the aftermath is maybe going to be the bigger impact. So not only would you have things like loss of riparian vegetation that's going to introduce a lot more sediment, you have landslides that's going to introduce a lot more sediment, that's going to affect reproduction, feeding behavior, a lot of different things. So that was already a concern, but then you have heavy machinery coming into the stream to remove debris, and while on the surface that can be a good thing to a degree, there's a lot of things in our streams that shouldn't be there that needs to be removed. we're concerned about the way that it's going forward because we know in certain circumstances they're removing really good high-quality habitat that was actually there before the storm. So it's a big concern, and actually over the last couple of weeks, we've been putting a lot of effort in on the computer trying to create maps of where we consider to have our highest quality habitat for each county, and we're trying to distribute that to the county managers who are working with the contractors that are actually in the streams removing the debris, and we're just hopeful that they'll be able to do what they can to try to oversee and cause as little impact to those high quality habitats as possible.
So I would be thinking a little bit about the health of the soil. If you mentioned that it's more than woody debris going into the streams. Well, there's a lot of runoff, and the soil's absorbed a lot of chemicals. I could think of all sorts of things that were flooded out of my house that you probably don't want spread out on the ground. It's gone into our soil, and so I would be thinking a little bit about additional monitoring after cleaning to make sure that the water quality isn't really being impacted as the upcoming rains are going to drain and infiltrate through the soil. It's going to get into our groundwater, and just being mindful of that. I think that would be what I would be thinking about.
I will say this concern is current. The work that we were doing post-Fred or even before that, this level of work, there are contractors out there that take this seriously, and they do the best that they can, and we're literally mapping out foot by foot, turn by turn, going through wooded areas to make sure that we are doing the least impact possible. And I think the situation we're seeing now across social and or the Wild West of getting in the water with the heavy equipment is what's causing this concern. That concern is real, but if done right, it does minimally impact the stream, and we ensure that after that project, after that pullout, it is restored as best as possible. So in this moment, it is a little stressful and concerning, I agree, and I think WRC and others are doing a great job of getting the message out there and jumping on spots where they see them. But in normal times, this method is very sustainable, and at least the best thing we have right now for the environment.
Yeah, I think that positive note is really important. Yeah, with that being said, so one thing that's related to what you were saying about waterway operations specifically is when operators, let's say a community member raises a red flag and says, in this particular area, I'm worried about the way the operators are functioning. I don't think that they're preserving the environment, what have you. There are mechanisms in place to make sure that if correction is needed, it's addressed. But also, we've had the same experience in the city of Asheville when we've raised concerns. We have stormwater experts that are doing some of the site visits, as well as we have a consulting firm as well who also have the appropriate expertise. And they will also address things as they see them, but for the most part, the response to concerns has been very quick, and oftentimes it's been a win-win situation. So we're all, I would say, living and learning through this process. So I would like to just basically ask them more of a softball question, if you will. So just kind of a fun question, especially for the younger members of the audience or people who are maybe going back to school for a degree in the sciences, specifically field-based sciences. What was the impetus that led you to either what you're doing now or maybe what you studied? Like what drove you to where you are today?
It's easy. I say that's easy. I tubed the tuck my first day at Western, spent probably 4 hours in the water, came out with purple abs because it was so cold, and I was just hooked onto the water. Through time, the environmental science program brought me out into the field. That was another win. Experiential learning I had not had prior to that, so that was interesting. I learned that I am a tactile learner. And then internships, which led to my first job. And if you're in Jackson County, I know I'm not speaking to that audience, but WATR, W-A-T-R is the org out there. So really it was just immersion, experiential learning style, and the opportunity and the pursuit of, furthering that curiosity through internships.
I grew up in Western North Carolina, so I spent a lot of time just outside, splashing around in the streams and stuff, and I always just kind of had a love for the aquatic environment. But when I started school, in undergrad, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I bounced around a little bit. I was a geology major for about a semester and just really wasn't sure. And then kind of settled on biology, environmental science. Knew I wanted to go that route. But right out of undergrad, I got an internship that really kind of changed my views. It was out in Yellowstone working on their lake trout suppression program with their fisheries crew. And it was just 3 months, but I fell in love with it there, and just knew I wanted to go into fisheries biology, and just continued on since.
So I had a very meandering route to where I ended up today. This is not what I imagined myself doing fresh out of high school. I really wanted to be a meteorologist on TV, and that ended in about the first semester of my undergrad. I got on front of the camera, and it was nothing like this. I completely froze. Who knows, maybe I do a better job now. So I quickly switched gears and decided I wanted to be a forecaster. I wanted to forecast weather. And unfortunately, because I chose the school to be a broadcast meteorologist, it did not mathematically or physics-wise align with what it takes to be a meteorologist. So I kind of just carved out my own path. I got a minor in physics. I got a minor in computer science. And I was trying to do all the things I needed to do so when I went to my master's, I could get the degree and become a meteorologist. And somewhere along that route, I ran into an amazing professor, Dr. Razul Mahmood, and he pointed me to science. And at the same time, my dad, who was he was the department head of architectural manufacturing, he was like, we have this new program, and no students have signed up for it. We need you to be a warm body in that. And it was Geographic Information Systems, GIS. And I just completely fell in love with that, and it connected meteorology, computer science, and visual learning, which is my way of learning. And you can really tell an amazing story with maps. So I wanted to find a field where I could connect all those, and that kind of slowly led me to this direction that I'm in now, where I'm looking at science and trying to convey information through maps and trying to make a positive difference in the world.
Yeah, thank you. Figuring out a way to convey important information to a very diverse audience is a very important part of what we do. All right, we have a few minutes. I'd love to open it up to audience questions. Does anybody have a question for any of our panelists? Yes, please go ahead.
What have been some of the biggest impacts from Helene, and what has been or is being done about it?
All right, so this audience member is asking what are some of the biggest impacts of Helene and what's being done about it. Is that correct? All right, thank you.
Lucky me, I'm first. Everything. I mean, if you're in the floodplain and or on the bank, you were impacted, right? So I think in particular, we tend to forget through this environmental summit, rather not necessarily we are forgetting, but in this conversation, the human factor, right? So the impact to everyday life, that future that someone had of beyond that moment in time is just altered. At the same time, too, we've noticed this split where folks are going on about their daily lives as if it never happened. So for us, trying to connect the awareness between the two populations while assisting the ones that have been impacted the most. And of course, at the same time, our mission is water quality, so we're trying to assist and repair and restore that environment. So what we saw with Fred in particular is just countywide now. I don't know if there's any one area of work that is more so than the other, or any other area that is more so in need than the other, but right now it's just scale. So for us, it's getting our head around that scale, conveying the message, and then mapping that out. Like I said, we're looking at a 10+ year horizon of work. So.
Yeah, I'll jump in with specifically the kind of work that I do with one specific example. The Appalachian elktoe is a federally endangered mussel that only exists in western North Carolina, and one of the best populations is in the Salto River, that Nolichucky system I was talking about. And we don't know exactly how bad it is, but we know that the numbers have been reduced dramatically. So something we did, we weren't planning on trying to propagate that population this year, but we went out last week and collected the gravid females, got them to the hatchery in Marion, got the host fish because mussels require a host during their early life stage, is parasitic for a few weeks. So we got all that into Marion, and then just heard word earlier today from the hatchery coordinator there that they successfully got those Glochidia from the mom Appalachian elktoe to attach to those host fish, about 46,000. So hopefully they'll be able to grow those out over the next year or two, and we'll be able to restock them back into that river to hopefully boost those population numbers.
Yeah, so great question, and I'm gonna kind of gonna tweak it a little bit, and instead of thinking of an impact in a negative perspective, I'm gonna try to go into a positive kind of framework. So when I look at the weather forecast and the stream flow forecast, having some background in broadcast meteorology and a little bit of forecasting that I do on the side, I understood all the forecast and all the information that was being thrown at me, but I still didn't know if my house was going to flood. So they predicted how much rain was going to fall out of the sky. They got really close on that. They predicted the stream flow within less than a foot of the river nearest my house. But I still didn't know if I was going to flood. And so one of the things that I think we as a community, at least the forecasting community, is really thinking about how can we contextualize this information, right? It isn't just about getting how much rain fell from the sky, how high the river's going to get, but actually putting it onto a map and trying to understand, do you live in an area where if the forecast is right, the water's going to get to? And that's the information. It's just that one extra step that I think the forecasting community is kind of missing. So that's like one impact where I think we could do better. So we have a lot of AI, we have a lot of technology, we have geographic information systems. We can go that extra mile, and that's what I really encourage the forecasters to try to look at and do. I know in my house now how high the river's got to get, but hopefully that's not the experience other people have to go through in order to figure it out. So that's
I'll
one thing.
piggyback on that. That's a constant need. Because that level you saw may not be the level if we had the same amount, because the rivers have changed. So the ability for that water to move, flow, store, peak, discharge, et cetera, is altered by every event. So the folks what they're doing over there, it's constantly needed. This awareness surges during hurricanes is kind of a great example of getting that message out to the community of where that surge may be coming to your property. It's extremely difficult to do that here in the mountains as our terrain changes from one event to the next. So this need of mapping, modeling, and forecasting, getting the message out is ever more important. And I'll say all this, what we're doing in response to Helene, y'all can help too, right? So there are a lot of volunteer events out there. We've got one tomorrow, cleaning up Jay Creek. We have a couple others coming in April. I would encourage you all to go to our website, haywoodwaterways.org, to find those events, to plug in. And trust that we're going to do the work that we do, and we'll continue to be here for the next quarter century or more, but we really rely upon the community to get this work done. So volunteerism is huge for us, and we encourage y'all to check us out in that regard.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That's
Okay.
so important.
All right, so our time is up. Thank you so much for attending this session. Thank you, panelists, for participating today. Really appreciate the conversation that we had today. And hopefully the audience will take a few tidbits back home with them. So thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you.